The summer of 1981 had settled gently over the quiet neighborhood of Belridge. The cicadas hummed lazily in the trees, and sunlight filtered through the leaves in warm, dappled patches across the sidewalks. On Cedar Street, where white picket fences framed nearly every yard, the Mitchell house stood modest and well-kept. Inside, the smell of cinnamon toast and orange juice filled the kitchen as Sarah Mitchell prepared breakfast for her 6-year-old triplets, Emily, Ethan, and Elise. They sat at the table in their usual order, the girls on either side of their brother, giggling about the shapes in their toast and taking turns reading from a picture book. Sarah watched them with a blend of joy and awe. Every morning, she silently counted her blessings, 3 healthy, bright children who never ceased to fill her days with life. She had raised them alone since their father died in a construction accident when they were barely 2. It hadn't been easy, there were times when money was tight, and her job at the local pharmacy barely paid the bills, but she never complained. All that mattered was them. It was a Saturday. No school, no daycare, and the sun was shining. The triplets had been begging all week to go to the little park down the street, just 2 blocks away, a place they knew by heart. Sarah usually insisted on going with them, but today, she hesitated. She was running late for a shift change at the pharmacy and needed to stop by the store before work. The kids were growing up, she thought. It might be time to give them a little space. All right, she said at last, kneeling down in front of them as they stood at the front door, bouncing with excitement. You can go to the park. But only for 1 hour. You stick together, no wandering off, no talking to strangers, and don't take candy from anyone. Understand? 3 voices echoed back in unison, yes, Mommy. She adjusted Emily's shoes, zipped up Ethan's windbreaker even though he protested it was too warm, and smoothed Elise's flyaway curls. Then she opened the door and watched them skip down the porch steps, hands linked, their laughter ringing like music through the morning air. She stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the doorframe, smiling as they turned the corner past the maple tree on the next street. And then, they were gone. The next hour passed quietly, too quietly. Sarah cleaned up the breakfast plates, folded a few towels, and then glanced at the clock. 45 minutes. Her heart began to quicken for reasons she couldn't explain. Something felt off. She walked out to the porch, sat in the rocking chair, and waited. The wind picked up. A dog barked down the street. She watched and waited. 60 minutes. Then 70. Panic bloomed suddenly, violently in her chest. She jumped up, ran barefoot down the sidewalk, calling their names. The park, when she reached it, was nearly empty. A boy on a bike. A woman reading a book. But no Emily. No Ethan. No Elise. She ran from swing set to jungle gym, shouting louder now, frantic. A stranger asked if she needed help. She could barely speak. By the time the police arrived, her knees had buckled. She clutched one of the triplets' toy hairbands she found near the sandbox like it was a lifeline. The officers began combing the area, canvassing houses, calling for backup. One of them gently tried to take her statement, but her voice came in broken sobs. That night, searchlights swept over the park and into the woods nearby. Volunteers arrived in waves, some with flashlights, others with dogs. But nothing. No footprints. No torn fabric. No sounds. Just absence. The triplets had vanished without a trace. The days that followed blurred into a strange, suffocating fog. Sarah barely slept. Every morning, she jolted. Awake with a gasp, thinking for a moment it had all been a nightmare, only to be hit by the crushing silence of the house. Their rooms remained untouched, beds still made from that morning, their favorite stuffed animals perched just where they left them. The police came and went in shifts, asking the same questions, bringing in sketch artists, even setting up tip lines. But nothing came of it. No witnesses. No sightings. No ransom note. It was as if the triplets had simply evaporated. Sarah stopped going to work. The pharmacy manager, a kind man named Mr. Ellison, told her to take all the time she needed. Eventually, he stopped calling. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened. She barely ate, only forcing herself to drink water so she wouldn't faint. Her once bright, composed face turned pale and hollow-eyed. Her neighbors started leaving casseroles on her porch. She didn't touch them. The sound of children laughing from nearby houses became unbearable. Every smile from another parent felt like an offense, every birthday balloon a reminder of what had been stolen from her. Flyers went up across town with the children's pictures. Sarah spent hours at the library using the copier, then walked for miles pinning them to telephone poles, bulletin boards, and gas station windows. Missing: Emily, Ethan, and Elise Mitchell. Age 6. Last seen July 18, 1981. Please help. She kept a stack in her purse, handing them to strangers at every grocery store, gas station, and rest stop she passed. Some people took them with a sympathetic nod. Others looked away quickly, uncomfortable in the face of her desperation. Weeks turned into months. Reporters stopped knocking. The local news stopped covering the case. Tips slowed, then stopped entirely. The detectives assigned to the case eventually moved on to other investigations. The hope of solving it faded from everyone's eyes, except Sarah's. For her, time simply froze. She refused to accept the idea that they were gone forever. She couldn't. A mother knows, she told herself, again and again. A mother would feel it if her children were dead. And she didn't feel that. So she began her own search. She sold her engagement ring, her grandmother's china set, anything of value, to hire a private investigator, an ex-cop named Bill Kramer who took the case at a discount because he had lost a son years earlier. Together, they drove across states following every tip, no matter how thin. A woman in Arizona thought she saw the children in a diner. Sarah flew out the next morning. False alarm. A letter came postmarked from Tennessee claiming the children were being held in a cult. Sarah went there too, nothing. Each dead end hit her like a truck, but she kept going, fueled by a determination that bordered on obsession. She started visiting psychics. Some were frauds looking for money. Others gave vague, poetic responses about the children being surrounded by trees, or on a journey of light. Sarah wrote every word down in a leather-bound journal, desperate to find patterns or clues. Her home became a fortress of maps, red yarn connecting pins, photographs, and handwritten notes. The kitchen table was buried under files and letters. Visitors were few, and even those who once cared began gently suggesting she move on. But she couldn't, not when her babies were still out there. By the time a year passed, Sarah had aged a decade. Her once soft-spoken demeanor was sharper now, laced with exhaustion and steel. She had become a woman living in a space between hope and torment, refusing to accept the unbearable, clinging to a single, unwavering thought. Until she had answers, she would not stop searching. By the 5th year, the missing posters had faded. Rain and wind had peeled most of them from the walls and poles they once clung to. The photos of the triplets, once clear and vibrant, now looked like ghostly echoes, their innocent smiles slowly being washed away by time. On paper, the case had gone cold. But for Sarah, it never stopped burning. She still visited the police station every few weeks, carrying her worn leather journal with notes, names, and dates. Most of the officers had changed over time, and the new ones treated her with polite detachment, their eyes betraying what they didn't say aloud. She's the woman from that old case. She hated the way they looked at her. Like she was a relic. A reminder of a tragedy they couldn't fix. Sarah's house had become a shrine to the children. Their bedrooms were exactly as they had been left that summer day in 1981. Emily's favorite yellow sweater still hung on the back of her chair. Ethan's toy dinosaurs lined the windowsill in a perfect row. Elise's watercolor paintings were still taped to the closet door. Every week, Sarah dusted the shelves, washed their sheets, and opened the windows to let in fresh air, as if they might come home at any moment. Her obsession hadn't faded, it had simply changed shape. She no longer chased psychics or tabloids, but she scanned online forums and missing children databases religiously. As technology advanced, she tried to keep up. She paid a technician to create age-progressed sketches of the triplets, imagining what they might look like as teenagers. She mailed copies to every missing persons organization she could find. Some responded with form letters. Most didn't. Friends had stopped calling. In the first year, there had been vigils and community fundraisers. People brought candles, wore matching ribbons, even helped search the woods. But over time, the crowds grew smaller, then disappeared. Sarah had become too intense, too consumed. Conversations with her always circled back to the triplets. It became too much for people to bear. They didn't know how to help her anymore. Even her own sister, Linda, who used to visit every weekend, now only sent holiday cards. Sarah kept them all unopened in a kitchen drawer. She didn't need sympathy wrapped in gold foil greetings. She needed answers. Her health began to decline. She lost weight. Her hands shook more often. Her hair, once deep auburn, had faded into a brittle gray. The circles beneath her eyes darkened from years of sleepless nights. But her eyes, those had not changed. They were sharp, vigilant, and haunted. Always searching. She started speaking aloud to her children at night, whispering into the silence of the house. "Are you safe?" she would murmur into the dark. "Are you cold? Are you hungry?" Sometimes she thought she heard their voices, just for a moment, like echoes in her dreams. She'd jolt awake, clutching her chest, straining to hear them again. One night, after reading yet another article about a child reunited with their mother after decades apart, she sat by the window with her journal on her lap. Rain tapped gently on the glass. She looked out at the street, empty and dark, and whispered to herself, "They're still out there. I know it." The world around her had moved on, rebuilt, and forgotten. But Sarah lived in the space between the moment they disappeared and the moment they might be found. It was the only place she felt alive. Everything else, every holiday, every birthday, every sunrise, was just time passing. Waiting for something that might never come. It was a gray afternoon in early spring, 30 years after the triplets vanished, when Sarah found herself wandering through a sleepy corner of a neighboring town she hadn't visited in decades. The rain had just stopped, leaving the pavement slick and the air heavy with the scent of wet bark and old brick. She had no destination in mind, only a restless need to get out of the house. Her feet moved without thought, guided by instinct or maybe something deeper. She'd passed a string of antique stores and thrift shops, the kinds of places filled with forgotten memories. One storefront caught her eye, not because of the faded sign that read Willoughby's Books and Curiosities, but because of the small, handwritten placard in the window, "Lost things find their way here." She stood staring at it, feeling something tug deep inside her. Almost reluctantly, she pushed the door open. The shop was musty and dim, with tall shelves that reached the ceiling and narrow aisles barely wide enough for one person. The owner, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses, gave her a silent nod from behind the counter. Sarah offered a polite smile and wandered deeper into the store, her fingers brushing the spines of books as she passed. There was no logic to the sections: cookbooks next to old encyclopedias, children's stories stacked beside military memoirs. Time seemed to bend in places like this. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just the comfort of being surrounded by stories. Her hand paused on a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. The corners were bent, the cover softened by years of being held and loved. It was the same book she used to read to the triplets before bed, one of their favorites. On a whim, she opened it. A small, folded piece of paper fluttered out and landed at her feet. She bent down slowly, her heart inexplicably racing. The paper was yellowed and creased, folded neatly into a tight square. There was no name on the outside, only the words written in careful, slanted handwriting, "To the mother who never gave up." Her breath caught. The noise of the world seemed to vanish around her. With trembling hands, she opened the letter. The writing was precise, deliberate. It didn't say much, just a few lines. 3 stars were taken, but not lost. Hidden, not harmed. Loved, though not by you. You'll know where to go when the time is right. April 19th, 4 p.m. The cabin where the river bends. Come alone. There was no signature. No contact number. Nothing more. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then held it close to her chest, as if afraid the words might disappear. Her knees felt weak, her head light. Was this a cruel joke? A coincidence? Or, could it be real? She returned to the counter, clutching the book and the letter, and asked the man behind the register if he knew who had brought it in. He looked over his glasses, then shook his head. "People leave books all the time," he said. "We don't keep track." Sarah didn't argue. She paid for the book, left the shop, and stood outside in the drizzle, the letter now tucked safely inside her coat. Her heart thudded against it like a warning or a promise. The date was just 4 days away. She knew the cabin mentioned. It had once belonged to a distant cousin, tucked deep in the woods beside a slow, winding river. They hadn't been there in decades. No one had. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her that wasn't grief or exhaustion. It was hope. Fragile, terrifying, and real. The road to the cabin hadn't been driven in years. Gravel crunched beneath Sarah's tires as her car crept along the overgrown path, its headlights cutting through the dense canopy of pine and maple trees. Branches reached over the narrow trail like bony fingers, and the forest grew darker the deeper she went. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, breath shallow. The letter sat on the passenger seat, folded exactly as she had found it. She had told no one where she was going. No friends, no neighbors, no one left who would believe this was anything more than another false lead. But this felt different. This wasn't a rumor or a psychic's vision. Someone had written directly to her. Someone new. As the car rounded the final bend, the cabin came into view, just as she remembered it from childhood visits. Small, weathered, with a slanted roof and moss climbing the stone chimney. The clearing around it was still, almost too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She parked and stepped out slowly, scanning the tree line, listening. There was no wind, just the distant trickle of the river that wound past the edge of the property. She approached the front steps cautiously. The door creaked open before she could knock. A man stood there, older, maybe in his 70s, with a long, gray beard and deep-set eyes that didn't flinch when they met hers. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he stepped aside, gesturing silently for her to come in. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished, just a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and a stone fireplace with charred logs. On the table sat a dusty metal box. Sarah's eyes locked on it immediately, drawn by some invisible force. Her chest tightened. The man finally spoke. His voice was low, sanded down by age and guilt. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just couldn't die without telling the truth." Sarah said nothing. Her eyes never left the box. He continued, pacing slowly. It was a group, a network, back then. Quiet, protected. They took children, ones they thought wouldn't be missed, or ones they could make disappear cleanly. You were marked because you had no husband. No family with influence. You were vulnerable. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed with rage, but her body wouldn't move. They took your children, split them up, rewrote everything. New names, new birthdays. They were adopted out to high-paying families, clean, on paper. No one ever asked questions. Tears stung her eyes, but still she said nothing. I was just the handler. Logistics. I didn't know their names, not at first. But I found out, years later. And I couldn't live with it. I tracked them as best I could. Not all of them, but enough. He slid the box across the table toward her. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside were 3 small baby bracelets, tarnished but intact, each one engraved with a name: Emily, Ethan, Elise. Beneath them, photographs. Dozens. Some old, some recent. Teenagers with eyes she knew too well. Elise's unmistakable curls, Ethan's quiet, serious gaze, Emily's wide, dimpled smile. They looked older now, maybe 16 or 17. But it was them. Sarah clutched one of the bracelets to her chest and finally broke. A sob tore through her, deep and animal. 30 years of waiting. 30 years of aching, unanswered questions. They're alive, the man said softly. I don't know if they'll remember you. I don't know if they'll want to. But they're safe. And they're out there. Sarah wept, not from relief but from the crushing weight of all she'd lost, and the flicker of something she hadn't felt in decades. A beginning. Sarah sat in her car outside the cabin for nearly an hour after the man had gone back inside and closed the door behind him. The box rested on the seat beside her, as if it were alive, humming with the unbearable weight of truth. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of images. Her babies at 6 years old, those same faces now older, sharper, familiar but distant. She had cried herself dry inside that cabin, and now there was only one thing left. She needed to know everything. 2 days later, Sarah met the man again, this time in a small coffee shop on the edge of the next town, far from curious eyes. He arrived wearing the same coat, eyes heavy with regret. She brought the box with her, not for proof, but for presence. It was the only thing anchoring her to reality. I need you to tell me everything, she said, voice low and tight. From the beginning. The man nodded slowly. His name, he finally revealed, was Gerald Holt. He had once worked as a transportation coordinator for a private child services firm in the early 1980s. What he described next made Sarah's blood run cold. The firm was a front, legal on the surface, but beneath it, a network operated by individuals who exploited broken families and legal loopholes. If a child was flagged by the state as at risk, due to poverty, isolation, single parenthood, or minor infractions, the network would quietly intervene before the case ever reached public attention. Parents would be manipulated or lied to, paperwork would be forged, and children would disappear into a system with false identities. Gerald explained how the triplets had been targeted. An anonymous tip had been filed accusing Sarah of neglect. There was no real investigation. The records had been fabricated to show endangerment. One night, under the guise of an emergency removal, the triplets were taken while they played alone in the park, lured by a familiar face, possibly someone posing as a social worker. They were taken to a holding house for 3 days. From there, they were separated and placed in different regions. Each adoption was arranged through a private placement agency, one that catered to wealthy clients who didn't ask questions. In exchange for silence, those involved were paid well and protected by complicit lawyers and insiders in family courts. Sarah listened, silent, her fingernails digging into her palms. Every word confirmed the horrors she had imagined but never dared speak aloud. Her children weren't lost in the woods or stolen by a stranger, they had been systematically erased, traded like property. I tried to get out, Gerald said. Years ago. But there were threats. They said I'd be next. I kept quiet for decades, until I started seeing their faces in my dreams. Until I saw their names on old files I couldn't throw away. He pulled a manila folder from his coat. Inside were copies of the falsified adoption papers, photographs, old documents with forged signatures, even an altered medical report claiming Sarah had been declared mentally unstable. It was overwhelming, but it was the truth. They were never supposed to know, he said. But now, it's your choice. Sarah stared at the documents, the photos, the lies that had shaped her children's lives. Rage burned in her throat, but beneath it was something stronger, resolve. She had always believed they were alive. Now she knew. She also knew the fight wasn't over. She would find them. She would face whatever pain that brought. But first, she had to track them down one by one, rebuild the connection stolen from them. The system had erased her from their memories. She would not let that be the final story. The first meeting happened in a small town outside Chicago. Gerald had provided Sarah with the most recent location for one of the triplets, Ethan, now going by the name Matthew Carver. He had been adopted by a well-off couple and raised in a quiet suburb, where he had grown into a disciplined and reserved young man. According to Gerald's notes, he had recently enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps and was home on leave. Sarah waited in her car across the street from a local cafe where he was scheduled to meet a friend. When she saw him step out of the cafe, her breath caught. He was tall, strong, with dark hair cut short and the same deep-set eyes she remembered, Ethan's eyes. He walked with purpose, his posture rigid, but his face held the quiet intensity she had known so well. Her hands trembled as she stepped out of the car. She crossed the street slowly, afraid she might collapse under the weight of the moment. "Excuse me," she said, barely above a whisper. He turned, polite but guarded. "Yes." She stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. Her throat tightened, heart pounding. She wanted to fall into his arms, cry, scream, explain everything, but she couldn't. I think you're my son," she finally said. His expression didn't change right away. He blinked, confused. "I'm sorry." She fumbled in her bag and handed him a photo, one from before they disappeared. Ethan, Emily, and Elise, sitting in the park in matching red shirts, smiling up at the camera. "I'm your mother," she said. "Your real mother. You were taken from me in 1981. Your name was Ethan." He studied the photo. His face tensed. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, or fear. But it was buried beneath decades of a life lived under a different name. "That's not possible," he said, stepping back. "I've had the same parents since I was 6. This is crazy." Sarah's heart cracked, but she stayed calm. "Please. I'm not here to ruin your life. I just needed to see you. I needed to know you were alive." He didn't respond. A long silence hung between them before he finally said, "I need time." Then he walked away. 2 weeks later, she received an email. It was from him. He had done a DNA test. It matched. The message ended with, "I don't know what this means yet, but I believe you." The second child, Elise, now Ava, was living in Seattle. A painter and part-time art teacher, she had grown into a woman of bright colors and quiet depth. Sarah approached her more carefully, reaching out through a letter. Ava didn't respond for a week. Then she called. "I've always felt like something was missing," she said softly. "Like I didn't fit." Their meeting was tender, emotional. Ava cried the moment she saw Sarah. She recognized her immediately. She had no memories of childhood, but she said Sarah's voice felt like home. The third reunion was the hardest. Emily, now called Danielle, had lived a turbulent life, multiple foster homes, a troubled adolescence, and years battling addiction. She was in a recovery center when Sarah found her. Danielle didn't believe her at first. She had been lied to too many times. Trust didn't come easily. But Sarah showed her the bracelet, the one with her name engraved. Danielle stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "I remember this." The reunion didn't come with hugs and joy. It came with tears, anger, disbelief. But she stayed. She listened. And when Sarah left, Danielle promised she'd call. 3 children. 3 lives. 3 strangers who had once shared a womb and a home, now scattered and shaped by separate destinies. Sarah had found them. But nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the same one that had been buried under missing posters and psychic notes for decades. Now it was covered in something else: documents, test results, emails. The box with the triplets, baby bracelets still sat nearby, its contents carefully arranged like relics of another lifetime. A week had passed since her reunion with Danielle, and while the emotional weight was still fresh, Sarah had begun doing what she always did when things didn't make sense: she searched for clarity. The thought had come quietly at first, a flicker in the back of her mind that she tried to ignore. But it grew stronger with every detail she learned about Danielle's past. Unlike Ethan and Elise, who had been adopted by families shortly after they were taken, Danielle had spent time in foster care. Her file, the one Gerald had given Sarah, had multiple redactions and gaps. It didn't align with the others. Her birthday had been listed as 3 weeks off from the original date, her medical history mismatched. And the bracelet, Sarah had found it in the box with the others, but it had always looked just slightly different, more worn, as if it had passed through more hands. Unable to shake the feeling, Sarah had requested DNA confirmation, not just between her and Danielle, but between all 3 siblings. She told herself it was to verify the story for the authorities she planned to report the adoption ring to. But deep down, she already feared the answer. Now, the results sat before her. She opened them with trembling hands. Her heart sank. Ethan and Elise, confirmed. A 99.99% genetic match. They were hers. No question. But Danielle's file was different. The markers didn't line up. She shared no maternal DNA with Sarah. And even more jarring, no matches with Ethan or Elise either. She wasn't their sister. Not biologically. Sarah stared at the words on the page, her mind struggling to process them. Danielle wasn't her daughter. She had been told she was. She had believed it with her whole heart. And yet, it wasn't true. A hollow ache filled her chest. Not because of the mistake, but because of the implications. Danielle had spent years believing she was unwanted, passed around in a broken system, and now Sarah had come into her life offering love, answers, and belonging. And it had all been based on a lie. Sarah didn't know how to feel. Betrayed, heartbroken, guilty, all of it at once. But even through the shock, one truth stood out clearly: Danielle had been a victim, too. Somewhere out there, another mother was still searching. Another family had been shattered. The next day, Sarah visited Danielle at the recovery center. Danielle met her with a tired but hopeful smile. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, "about what happens next." Sarah took a seat across from her, setting the folder gently on the table. "I need to tell you something," she said, voice unsteady. "Something important. And it's going to hurt." Danielle looked at her, confusion spreading across her face. Sarah hesitated, then handed over the DNA results. Danielle's hands trembled as she read. When she looked back up, her expression was unreadable. "So I'm not your daughter." Sarah reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You may not have come from me. But you're not nothing to me. You were taken, just like they were. Lied to, just like I was. And now, maybe we can find out who you really are. Together." Danielle didn't speak for a long moment. Then she nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I don't care what the paper says, she whispered. You're the only person who ever came looking. In that moment, the truth didn't destroy them. It created something else, something fragile, yet real. A bond not of blood, but of healing. Of choosing each other in the aftermath of everything lost.